good, we've got a shouty one. Good evening and welcome to Prairie Lights. I'm Kathleen Johnson, the events coordinator here, and tonight I am very pleased to welcome Thisbe Nissen back to Iowa City with her husband, J. Baron Nicorvo, who I am very pleased to welcome to Iowa City and to Prairie Lights to read from their new novels. And this is just one stop on their Our Lady of the Prairie Standard Grand Tour, which began January 24th in Newton, Massachusetts, and will conclude in San Diego on March 7th with hopefully some breaks in there, because they have their youngest member of the family, well, their son, joining them. They'll be visiting some great independent bookstores, and we're honored to be part of it. Thisbe Nissen, some of you may know, is a Writers' Workshop graduate, and so it is particularly special to have her back here in Iowa City and at Prairie Lights. She's the author of the novels The Good People of New York and Osprey Island, and a story collection, Out of the Girls' Room and Into the Night. She's also the co-author of The Ex-Boyfriend Cookbook, a collection of stories, recipes, and art collages. Her writing has been published in the Iowa Review, the American Scholar, Story 17, Virginia Quarterly Review, Story Quarterly, Glimmer Train, Vogue, Glamour, and The Believer, and is featured in several anthologies. Thisbe has taught at Columbia University, the Iowa Writers' Workshop, Brandeis University, the New School's Eugene Lang College, and in the low residency MFA program at Pacific University. She's an associate professor of English at Western Michigan University. Thisbe Nissen and J. Baron Nicorvo are parents to two old cats, hopefully still.
Oh, two young cats now.
Two young understudy cats, many sprightly chickens, and one intriguing human child. They dream one day of raising goats, which is a dream I think a lot of us can relate to. We're very happy to have them here tonight.
It's so great to be here. I lived in Iowa City for 12 years and planned to stay forever, and it didn't quite work out that way, and things have worked out fine, but it still feels a lot like home, and it's really nice to be back. I think a lot of writing this novel was coming back or staying here or something in my mind, so it's nice to be back where it started. I'm going to start from the beginning so I don't have to contextualize anything. Because every time I start trying to talk about what this novel is about, which I've been working on this book for so long, and I still can't get my brain around what it's about or speak eloquently at all about it. So the novel's told in 7 long chapters. The first is called My Husband Was Dresden. From the moment I saw Lucius Baselli, I wanted to go to bed with him. If I'd known then what Michael would put me through by way of penance in 26 years of marriage, you'd think if he'd needed so badly to spank me, he'd have found the opportunity. I might have simply given in. Instead, I spent 3 months in tortuous longing before succumbing to all I felt for Lucius. But retrospect is convenient, life less so. Even if I should have foreseen, or already known of, my husband's peccadillos, I still could not have gazed into the future to know, say, the path that May's tornado would take across Iowa, straight through our daughter's wedding. I met Lucius in late January. I'd just arrived in Ohio for my semester's teaching exchange. He was recently back from a 1.5 years in France, a research sabbatical he'd extended with an additional 6-month leave. His work was on Nazi collaborationists of the Vichy regime, and he'd be headed back to France that summer. But when we met, it was only January. The Democrats hadn't even nominated someone to run against W and bar him from a second term. Bernadette, the mother-in-law whose belligerent existence I'd suffered for more than half my life, was still alive and kicking me at every available opportunity. And Ginny wasn't yet married to Silas Yoder or pregnant and off her psych meds and once again as miserable as she'd been before the electroshock. Ora and Obadiah Yoder were already dead. Silas and Eula's parents, hit head-on and killed by an SUV in their own buggy in front of their own prairie farm. And a year had done little to dissipate that pain. The birth of Eula's baby had diverted us, yes. My point is this. When I met Lucius, my life was more stable than it had been in 25 years. I met him, and I wanted him, more clearly and maybe less complicatedly than I think I have ever wanted anything in this life. There had been a reading at the U of O, a progressive political commentator, with a gathering afterward at the dean's home for the obligatory university-issued cheese and cracker platters and a Midwestern supermarket arrangement of crudité, concentric motes of gray-tinged cauliflower, parched baby carrots, and inedibly mushy grape tomatoes surrounding the ranch dip bowl. Guests represented the left of the U of O faculty, and there was a collective relief at being surrounded by other sane people at a time when the main hell, the only criteria for sanity were A, abject terror at the State of the Union, and B, downright hatred of the president, who had about as much ability to run the country as one of our thick-headed 18-year-old frat boys. And less humility, which is almost inconceivable. The wine flowed that night, and it was lousy, but it was on the U, so we drank with zeal. In Ohio, at the end of January, 4-foot snowbanks turning the campus into a giant ice maze, you drink what's offered, and you're grateful. I'd gotten a lift to the dean's house from Anthea Lingefelter, a romanticist. As we entered, I saw leaning in the arch of the foyer a man I took instantly to be the actor Ed Harris. I'd like to imagine my next thought would have been, what the hell is Ed Harris doing here? But Anthea had paused to make introductions, and my hand was already extended as I heard her say, Philippa Mockstad, on loan to us, theater. I was beaming a sort of, I thought Pollock was brilliant smile, when it seemed that, of this man whose hand I was shaking, Anthea was saying, Lucius Baselli, history. His expression mutated from pleased to meet you to perplexity. I'd been holding his hand far longer than appropriate and dropped it abruptly, jerking away. A step behind my own actions, the soundtrack of my brain was out of sync with the picture. I shook hands with the others in the group, registering nothing. Then Anthea guided me away toward a den, slipping her parka onto a futon couch where coats were being piled. I thought he was Ed Harris, I told her. Anthea glanced back, her look inscrutable to me, and said, Lucius? When I made a face to say, yes, the Ed Harris look-alike, who else? She lifted her chin and let out a hoot that only became clear much later when Lucius told me of the affair they'd had years before. Lucius, I will note, had nothing to do with Anthea's divorce. I encountered him minutes later, online at the makeshift bar. He came up behind me. The wine's no good, he said, but it makes the socializing go down easier. I was conscious of my own breath. I heard it like the rush of wind through a tunnel. And I'm not a woman often conscious of her own breath. I'm so sorry. I lifted my hand toward the site of our introduction. I thought you were Ed Harris. I shook my head in castigation for my absurdity. A smile spread across his face, crinkling his eyes, and I saw he was older than I'd realized. For no reason I can understand, it was this that hit my pelvis. Realization of his age somehow turned my breathless giddiness into grave desire. Lucius's eyes, pale blue, were deeply set, corners striated with wrinkles, the skin there thin and tissuey as parchment. I had to physically restrain myself from lifting my hand to run a thumb across that delicacy. His face was so hard and sculpted, it made that thin skin at the corners of his eyes seem all the more fragile, their sadness devastatingly palpable. To see him smile felt like a triumph, and I may have known then that I would love this man with a ferocity and an urgency and a gravity I had never experienced before. He dropped his chin, tucked it to his neck, and peered at me as if over reading glasses he wasn't actually wearing. I suspect, he said, you just can't tell one bald man from another. Come on, I said. It's not like I mistook you for Danny DeVito. His grin broke wide again, the shine of those sad, deep-set eyes. He conceded my point. Or Gandhi, I said. No, he said thoughtfully, mock thoughtfully. No, not Gandhi. Bruce Willis, Telly Savalas, Yul Brynner. Now you're talking really bald. I have my scruff. He fluffed at his hair. My tufts. Which, I pointed out, is why I thought you were Ed Harris and got a bit tongue-tied. Lucius looked suddenly disappointed. He'd glanced at my left hand. You're married. Without thinking, I shifted my hands on my hips to cover my knuckles, absurdly hiding the ring he'd already seen. You? I asked. He tipped back his plastic glass, drained its dregs, stuck it in the underarm crook of his blazer, and held his hands out as though I'd asked to inspect his fingernails. Because of the cup, one arm was hitched up shorter than the other, his back bent as if in half-hearted Igor impersonation. His fingernails were clean, cut short, healthy pink, and he had small hands, downy with grayed hair I could tell had once been golden blonde. They made me think of lifeguards on the California beaches of my childhood. Muscled hands, thick-veined, wiry like the rest of him. He's sinewy, compact as a greyhound. He wore no ring. Thrice was plenty, he said, then straightened up and caught his cup as it fell. I'd be lying to say I wasn't alarmed. 3 marriages, but he was so forthcoming, and emotion overrode skepticism. I was already in love and reconciled the question immediately. 1 failed marriage in this era barely warrants mention. At our age, 2 is hardly surprising. 3, though, calls for a story. A brief starter marriage, maybe. Then a long-term one ending in her death, cancer, and then an awful grief-spurred 6-month catastrophe. That's what I imagined. Kids? I asked. And I'd like to think if he had more than, say, 4, or any were still underage, I would have run, but I'd probably have found a way to reconcile that too. He was nodding. 2 from my second marriage. Jesus, they're middle-aged, he said sheepishly. Hannah and Tim, both married, kids of their own who aren't even kids anymore. He laid it out like he was coming clean. Grandkids? How old are you? I'd assumed he was maybe Michael's age, 60-ish. Lucius chuckled. Put it this way, I'm Medicare eligible. You are not. His lips closed in a knowing line. Oh yes, indeed I am. And yourself? 50, I told him. And the rest? My eyes felt extraordinarily wide. I dropped my hands and faced him like a refugee, like someone with nothing left to lose, which wasn't the case at all. 1 daughter, Ginny, 25, getting married in May. It was so easy to say, just like that. I'd practically written Ginny a new life story, leapt over years of hospital corridors and caloric mandates, meth dens and court orders, razor blades, and electroconvulsive shock, flew over it all and announced that I had a daughter about to be married. It wasn't a lie. It was entirely true, and it was glorious. Mazel tov, he said. You're a Jew? I said. My mother was, he answered. Mine too, I said, and my father. And you? He asked. Me what? You're a Jew unto yourself? Not really. Me neither, he confessed. I never was growing up, but in Iowa I sort of am because no one else is. My parents weren't at all. My father's folks were. They were the ones who came over. A job at UC got my grandparents out of Germany early, turned them into Golden State Jews. You're from California. He looked delighted. Where? Bay Area, Berkeley. Lucius smiled, tipped his empty cup to his chest. L.A. He shook his head. 2 California Jews in the heartland. My husband calls me a Murphyist. It was the wrong thing to say. Giving voice to Michael made him real and present, and me terribly uncomfortable. To cover, to lose the word husband among others, I babbled. And anything that can go wrong will, framework, with a healthy Judaic fear of the kinehora thrown in. Don't draw attention to the good, or it will turn to shit. I'd call it a kind of non-sectarian superstitionism, if you will. Lucius said. My memory goes a little funny from there. I'm pretty certain that's all we said, but I don't know how much time passed before I reawoke to our surroundings and realized we'd been staring at each other as the bar line split and re-merged around us like a river past a boulder, there in the middle of Dean Sewell's living room. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Do we have a question here?
Sana always has a question, so if anyone else wants to get a question in first, or we can break the ice.
I think this is a good icebreaker right here.
All right. Is it going to be a question?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
It's for Jay. Also Dad. Thisbe, you explained how your main character, Philippa, am I getting the name correct? Is partly a Jew. Is your character partly a Jew at all?
My character is what's known as a goy, a non-Jew, or a Gentile.
Okay.
But very good question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
Excellent. And question number 2.
Other questions.
That was not what I was expecting.
I'm sorry, what's your name?
Thisbe?
Okay. Sorry. So your book, is it fictional or non?
It is totally fictional.
Okay.
And it's funny you should say that, because when I started writing it, I started writing this book when I was about 30. The early drafts I have that I wrote should I do that?
The earliest thing, I knew I was working on this big novel, and I didn't know where to enter it. And the first thing I tried to do, I knew there was going to be a wedding that took place, and a tornado was going to come through. And I thought, okay, I'll write the scene of that wedding tornado. And the early drafts I have of that story, and I wrote it as a story unto itself, are from 2002. So I was 30. And when I started out, Philippa was 57. And in the years that have passed, I have gotten older and Philippa has gotten younger. And I don't know that there was a conscious decision to do that at some point. It was just, you run into all of these things while you're writing, like, oh, if I want her to have been alive at X and such time, like she had to have been born then, and you run into all these just sort of logistical things so Philippa wound up getting younger, I get older, and now here we are, and we're coming into the world. She's 50 and I'm almost 46, so we kind of grew together in the time it took me to get the book out.
Well, both of your books are very firmly established in a sense of place, that where they take place is so important. And I wondered if either of you had any comments about that. I mean, you live in very different, I guess not very different, but you live in a different place now than either of your works take place.
I think we were in the Catskills, living in the foothills of the Catskill Mountains when I started in 2009. But I think it probably wasn't until we moved away 1 year later when the novel kind of came to life. And Thisbe was 2 years into her book when she and I started our relationship. And shortly thereafter, sometime thereafter, she left Iowa to move back east. I don't know if leaving the place, leaving the Catskills for me, and then leaving Iowa for Thisbe somehow evokes the nostalgia that's necessary to evoke a setting like that. But I think both our novels are rooted in place, in part because we no longer were.
I definitely think, much of this was, I don't know, my love letter to Iowa or something. I grew up in New York City, and I came here at 23 to go to grad school, and I kind of felt at home for the first time maybe in my life when I got here. And I had a good friend who I met here in Iowa, and at some point after we'd lived here together for years, she got a job in New York and moved there briefly, and she called me up a few weeks after she arrived in New York, and she said, "Oh my God, I feel like I understand you now. Iowa City is the antithesis of New York." I said, "Yes, it is, and I appreciate it every single day." And I think I was writing myself back into Iowa for a lot of it. Thanks, Donna.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Okay, questions?
Well, I have a question for Jay.
I mean, you're military, do you have a military background?
I have no military background, none
Because
whatsoever.
you sound like you really know military.
I'd say, I grew up poor, working class. Without a dad, my mom has worked at a 7-Eleven for 30 years. Like the people who spend time in the military, they come from working class families for the most part. It's a job prospect. I almost enlisted on 2 occasions. The main character, as I mentioned, as I read in the beginning, is based on my sister-in-law. I grew up around people who enlisted all the time, so it was very familiar to me. But in order to write my way into the intimacy of that situation and those foreign lands, I just had to do a ton of reading. I read everything I possibly could. I have friends who, after I had finished draft, a final, I say final, but it wound up being probably, the first phase of 10 different phases. But after I felt like I had a finished draft, then I went to a couple friends who were veterans, and they helped fact check the book. My copy editor at St. Martin's was a vet, so that helped a good bit. But for the most part, I read. I didn't interview, I'm not a journalist. I was familiar with the people, I think, given my background, and then I just did research. I just tried to read everything that I could.
Well, what was it like trying to put out a work of fiction after having published a volume of poetry? And was poetry something that you had always done and then you switched, or have you always done both?
I think I've long been a closet novelist. And even when my collection of poems came out, I was working on novels. This first novel is the 4th one I finished. I started my first as an undergrad when I was 19. And I often worked in both genres and in nonfiction too, and really used one genre to spell the monumental rejections of another genre. So, I would finish a novel, and then I couldn't get an agent for it, and so then I would set it aside, and I would go back to working on poetry, and I would work on poetry for a time, and then I would have another idea for a novel and start that and spend 2 or 5 years working on that novel, and maybe that novel got me an agent, but she couldn't publish it, and so then I'd go back to poetry, and I often use one genre to sort of spell the disappointments of another.
Well, Thisbe, for you, how has this book, the publishing of this novel, how is it different from when you were first starting out?
No, my path through sort of the world of publication was a strange one. I came, I wrote a novel as my MFA thesis, and the only people in the world who can read it are people who have access to the University of Iowa Library, because that's where it lives. It got me an agent who couldn't sell it, and it didn't seem like, I didn't know what I was doing. I was 25, and I was working on short stories too, and then my story collection won the Iowa Short Fiction Prize and was published by U of I Press here, and that kind of started a whole bunch of things. Then I sold a novel, and I actually got a 2-book deal for a novel I had already written and a novel that wasn't yet written. This was back when things like this happened. I don't think they happen anymore, and I fully knew when it was happening that nothing like that would ever happen to me again. And but it's what enabled me to buy a house in Iowa City and live and write for a little while. And then Jay and I met in 2006, and that was kind of when I was running out of money and needed a job, and so was on the job market, and working on this book was I was doing a lot of other things at the same time. I was moving across country twice and getting married and having a baby and getting a tenure track job and getting tenure and lots of life stuff. So this took a lot longer, and it was a fight to it looked for a long time like nobody was going to publish it. It was there were a lot of fights along the way, and then I found a wonderful editor who kind of got it and got what I was trying to do and helped usher it through. So it feels like a tremendous relief that this book exists in the world, and somehow it feels scarier now, maybe because I know a lot more. I think it was a rush then. It was a rush. It was traumatic too in ways, but I didn't, it was all kind of happening to me a lot, and I think it feels scarier now because I'm more cognizant of what it means to put something out into the world, maybe.
What's the difference between with your first book, with when you were like, wow, I'm an author now? How is that different from what it really is? What is really? How is that different from what it really means to be an author?
It's there was when I finished grad school, there was a sense of, no one ever thought, we knew you couldn't make money writing books, and so I loved teaching, and I thought I just want to publish a book so I could apply for teaching jobs and get a teaching job. And then I published a book and I applied for all sorts of teaching jobs and I didn't get them, and I spent years and years and years then I had more luck publishing books than I did getting a teaching job, and so it's just a really straight, things just didn't work the way I thought they were going to work. I was willing to get a job and nobody would give me one, and now that you have one you don't want. And now that I have one, exactly, I'm ready to retire. Oh. I think David might have a question there behind you.
Thank you. First, I'd say this is one of the most surprising readings I've ever been to, and I've been to a bunch, in a very nice way. Your protagonists are people I wouldn't have imagined in either case. And Jay tells us a very interesting story of how he got in touch with his protagonist and what it meant to him. And I was thinking of you and yours. It seems highly unusual. I may be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. Highly unusual for a 20-something-old girl to start a novel about a 50-something-year-old woman. And it's against the advice of all the agents in the world that I've ever run across. And I just
Mine
wonder,
included.
I just wonder how that happened and how if you could tell more about how you grew into that relationship.
Part of it's been so long I can hardly even remember at this point. I think I often enter a character or enter a piece of writing to try to make sense of something that I don't understand or can't understand or really want to understand but sort of can't fathom. And I think I was watching my mom and watching the moms of close friends of mine get older, and you know, in some cases they're divorcing husbands, in some cases having spouses die, and entering a world of like sexual and relational negotiations that they hadn't done in a really long time, and I think I was really fascinated and wanted to kind of try to write myself into that and understand what they were going through in some ways. That's about as close as I can get to figuring out where Philippa came from exactly.
Where did that,
Sandy.
where did that name come from?
Oh God,
Philippa.
Philippa.
That's what I wondered right away.
You know what? I have no idea anymore. You know, some things I can trace, but that I don't really know. And I don't even, her last name is Mockstad. And I probably like went through like the Iowa City phone book or something, or some other phone. I mean, I probably just combed through for names that struck me as interesting. I really have no idea at this point.
One of Thisbe's favorite days of the year is when the Social Security Administration releases its annual report of names.
Oh, you lose days of your life on the website of plugging in like the most popular baby names. You can go back to the 1800s. I mean, you spend a lifetime being named Thisbe, and I think it has to explain somewhat my fascination with names, but I'm totally riveted.
If I could, I would just like to speak to David's question for my part. There were so many, I think, reasons for my choice of a point of view character. You know, I think just maturity, coming into middle age, and maybe the opening up of the world, seeing more of it. You know, I know that maturity doesn't necessarily translate to a greater sense of empathy for some of us, and certainly not wisdom. But for me, if there was one largest factor, I think he's sitting there in that first row. I started this novel in 2009, and Thisbe got pregnant shortly thereafter. And I think it was just confronting this sense that in order for me to keep this other creature alive, this creature who could not express himself, I was going to have to be able to see the world through his eyes. And I think really it was, if anything, if there was one, if I could point to one leap, and I don't even know if it's necessarily true or not, but if I could, I think it would be fatherhood, and the leap required to be a decent parent and to keep this offspring alive. You know, I mean, like other parents don't really tell you what you're doing in the early goings. Like, you're just trying to keep this creature alive. And people, I think, who do that well, have a larger sense of empathy. And so to just start seeing the world in a new way through the lives of an other, I think really broke and cracked my fiction open in a way that it hadn't before. My first three novels were much more autobiographical, and there's plenty of autobiography in here, but it's sort of so far removed from the story. So if there was one thing that I would point to, it would be parenthood.
You mentioned writing the wedding tornado scene out of order. Is that something that you like to do, or is that something that you'd recommend?
Oh, the writing out of order.
Yeah.
You know, it's not something I've really done before, and I think it was because I had a lot of ideas that were spinning around in my head, metaphorically tornadically. And I didn't know how to start. I felt overwhelmed to start, and I thought, okay, Thisbe, you have to just start somewhere, like jump in somewhere. And I knew this one scene, and I kind of gave myself a challenge. And I was thinking a lot at the time about the shapes of stories, and I gave myself the challenge. Could a story take the shape of a tornado? Like, could a tornado give structure to a story? And that was sort of the challenge I set myself with. The point of view is totally different in that story. It's not told. It's a very omniscient third person. It kind of more the tornado telling the story than anything else. So it wasn't, and the novel is in Philippa's voice. So it was very different, and yet it gave me a point of entry. Like, you make a decision, you sit down and you have to make some choices. Okay, what's the point of view going to be? And so you make a decision, and you make that decision maybe in order to find out, oh, I was wrong and I need to make a different decision. But then you've made it, then you're working with something, then there's something on the page. So I think for me, I needed to do it. It was a way in. So I think whatever gets you inside it, you do, and you chalk it all up to process, and nothing's wasted in the end. It's all worth it.
I think this should be our last question.
So speaking of losing hours on a website, I would just like to say, Thisbe, you are 100% responsible for my addiction to WebBoggle. Thank you for the recommendation.
Thank you.
But for a question for the two of you, here's my question is, with writing in the sense of a creative act, what do you do when you hit a point where you get stuck? And how do you forge through?
I quilt. And I take photographs, and I make collages. Also, I pretend that the things I'm writing aren't writing. I print the whole thing out, and then I chop it in little pieces with scissors and tape, and I tape it to yellow legal pads and write other things. So it's not really writing, it's like crafting. And then I've gotten past the like blank page spot. For me, it's like turning it from a mental exercise into like a tactile, physical exercise that gets me going in another direction.
I try not to get stuck. I think I've arranged my life with Thisbe, together, so that I've kind of set up all of these ways I fool myself. I think I don't work long. I work in the mornings, just insanely caffeinated for a few hours in the morning, and stop after a few hours. I do it every day. I find that if I'm just doing it every day, and I don't write a lot. I'm a very slow writer. I'm a slow reader. But I find if I just have the time every day where I'm just sitting at my desk doing something, sometimes I'm just reading. If I'm just there, there's no sticking. It's just a part of my day. There's nothing to get stuck about. And if I don't have any ideas or I'm not producing anything, then that's just one day among a countless unbroken line of days. So when I'm working, for me the priority is just to keep working. And that just means just stay at my desk a little bit every day. And at lunchtime I stop. And after lunch I don't go back to it. I go for a jog. And on my jog I often have revision ideas. And so I take notes throughout the day. Right before we go to bed, I'll plan and we'll be reading, a review or something, and always have pen and paper at my bedside. So there's always notes, there's always stuff being generated. But I think that for me the key has been to not invest too much in the generative act, in the moment, that it's all day long, and it's just a part of my day, like like going to the bathroom is. It's almost utilitarian. It's like becomes hygienic. Really, I mean, it does. Like, if I don't have that time in the morning, I go a little bit crazy. And I get frustrated, and I get anxious, so everything gets disturbed and upset. So I just try to give myself a couple hours every morning, and for me, that has really prevented me from feeling stuck.
I think that was also known as the Frank Conroy ass in chair school of writing. I mean, I feel like that's what I learned in grad school. Was like,
And so you
put your ass in the chair.
You have to have your motivation. You have to have your models. And for me, it's my mom. My mom did not miss a day of work. I mean, she had 3 young boys at home, and she was always standing there behind the counter of a 7-Eleven, ringing up Slurpees and cold cut sandwiches and people's gas. And I think about my mom often, and I think like she got up every day and went to 7-Eleven. Like the least I can do is sit down at my desk for a couple hours a day. And then my mom calls and
Well,
I think that was it. That was
So
the
that
last
was it,
question.
Sana. But you can ask your question later. You know where to find us.
You know where we live.
It's a good question. All right, well, we can take it off the air.
All right, we'll take one
Unless
last question.
okay.
This is fine.
Okay, you won them over.
This is for Jay/Dad again. You said that you try to keep yourself from being stuck. If you were running down a road, and the road is your book, and there's obstacles in your way, would I be the biggest obstacle?
All right, I think we could probably leave that as our question.
No, you're not the biggest obstacle. I am the biggest obstacle.
All right.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And both authors will be happy to talk with you and sign copies of the book.